the real-life string of in the 1990s that inspired the very famous horror movie Scream. Patricia and Frank's daughter, 17-year-old Christine, was going to be a freshman that year at the University of Florida. Christine and her new roommate, 18-year-old Sonia Larson, had moved in to this white apartment complex that Patricia and Frank were now parked outside of. She told Patricia and Frank that she would call them the following day. But the following day came and went. Patricia and Frank did not hear from their daughter. They walk up to her door, and before they even knock or turn the doorknob or anything, they notice on the door there are all these notes. And they were notes from some of Christine and Sonia's friends on campus that apparently had tried to stop by over the last weekend, but had not been able to make contact with Christine or Sonia. And they just start knocking on the door and calling out for their daughter. But there's no answer. So the maintenance worker calls the police and requests this escort, and a few minutes later, a single Gainesville police officer arrives at the apartment complex. The maintenance worker gets out his keys, he finds the right one, and he opens Christine and Sonia's door. Frank and Patricia start running into the apartment, and they see their daughter, Christine. She has no clothes on, and she's been stabbed to death. This one police officer, he goes upstairs, and he finds Sonia. She's laying on her bed, and she's been stabbed to death. The officer at this point leaves the apartment and he uses his radio to call in for backup. And right away, they discover markings on the edge that looked like someone had used a screwdriver or some similar instrument to pop open the door. Based on what they saw inside of this apartment, the police were convinced they were up against a group of killers or a killer that had targeted these two girls. And if they didn't get caught, they were going to strike again. 12 hours before Christine Powell and Sonia Larson were discovered, an 18-year-old Gainesville woman named Krista Hoyt did not show up for work. In the very early hours of Sunday morning, the sheriff's office called the Gainesville police and asked them to do a welfare check on Krista. Krista is sitting on the edge of a bed. The forensics team immediately noticed there were marks on the backsliding glass door where someone had used probably a screwdriver or something similar to pop the door open. As all this chaos is kind of unfolding in town, the police put hundreds of officers all over the place, on foot, on every street corner, but as it would turn out, it didn't work. By the following morning, so Monday morning, what was happening in Gainesville had gone from just being a Florida story to a national story. And one woman named Lisa Byers, who was in her 20s, she did not live in Gainesville, but she had a very close friend who did. She was 23-year-old Tracy Paulus. Lisa called Tracy and said, hey, I'm watching the news. This is crazy what's happening in your town. How are you holding up? And Tracy would tell her that, I'm just as concerned as everybody else. But I think I'm okay because I have my roommate. Tracy's roommate was 23-year-old Manny Taboda, who was this big, strong, former football player. And so she told Tracy, please give me a call this evening after you come back from classes just to let me know that everything is okay. And so Tracy said she would, and then they hung up. And then that evening, Tracy did not call Lisa back. And so Lisa tried calling Tracy, but no one picked up. And so Lisa reached out to a mutual friend of theirs that lived in the same apartment complex in Gainesville. His name was Tommy. And so she asked Tommy, can you please go over to Tracy's apartment and make sure she and Manny are okay? And so Tommy said, no problem. And so about 5 minutes later, Tracy got a call. She picked it up, and it was Tommy calling from Tracy's landline, and he was just screaming. When the police arrived at Tracy's apartment, they found Tracy in her bedroom. She had been stabbed to death. And then down the hall from Tracy, they found Manny. He was in his bed, and he too had been stabbed to death. The FBI approached the Gainesville police and said, hey, why don't you use our VCAP program? And what it was this computer program where it allowed investigators to input details of their crime they were investigating. And when they submitted it, it would be compared against this huge database of other crimes in the country. And so when the Gainesville police input the information from these 5 student slayings in Gainesville, the computer program spit out a single match. It was from an unsolved triple homicide in 1989 in Shreveport, Louisiana. 8-year-old Sean Grissom was dropped off at his grandfather's house in Shreveport. The grandfather, Tom, yelled out to the boy's mother and said, I'll have him back by Monday. I'll drop him off, see you later. Monday morning, when Sean is supposed to be dropped off early enough that she can take him to school, when he doesn't show up, the mother calls the grandfather back and tries to get in touch and figure out what's going on, but she can't get in touch with him. And the police actually get in in touch with the neighbor of Tom Grissom, and they ask this neighbor, hey, can you go next door and just make sure Tom and Sean and Julie are okay? And so the neighbor walks around to the front door, and they notice there are lights on inside, and they're able to get into the house through the garage. And this neighbor, they immediately see on the ground towards the back door near the kitchen is Tom. He's laying on the ground, and he's obviously deceased. Sean Grissom, the 8-year-old, he's slouched over on the couch in front of the TV, and he's been stabbed to death as well. And then upstairs, they found 24-year-old Julie, the aunt, and she was positioned on the edge of the bed. And so as these Gainesville police are looking at this report in this VCAP computer system, and they're reading about this unsolved triple homicide, all they can think about is how unbelievably similar the crime scene was to all the crime scenes of the student slaying. This woman named Cindy, who lived in Shreveport, she called the police after watching all the news like everybody else, and told the police they really ought to look at this guy, Danny Rawling. Danny Rawling was this 37-year-old drifter who was in Shreveport at the time of the Grissom family in 1989, and apparently after those he had told Cindy's husband that he, quote, had a problem, and Danny literally always walked around with a huge knife on his waist. He seemed totally mentally unstable. Cindy and her husband took literally and basically told him to stay away from them. When police asked Cindy, do you think he's capable of killing all 8 of these people? She said, oh yeah. And so the police turned their attention to Danny and began researching his background, and they discovered he was raised in a very abusive household. Specifically, his father really couldn't stand him. Danny gets in this huge fight with his father. He runs out of the house and he gets his gun from his vehicle, comes back inside his house and shoots his father. His father would amazingly survive this attack. Before long, there was a warrant for Danny's arrest for attempted. But when they went to go arrest him, he was gone. And so as the Gainesville police are looking at Danny's criminal record, they're starting to say to themselves that this guy looks really interesting. One of the Gainesville police officers suddenly thinks of something. There was this unsolved armed robbery of this bank in Gainesville that happened the same week where all 5 of the students had been killed. A lone masked gunman walked into this bank in broad daylight and demanded money from the teller, and the teller, who thought on their feet, gave him the cash, but it was the type that was booby-trapped with dye packets, meaning if this robber tried to tamper with the money at all, it would detonate, sending dye all over them and kind of making it obvious that this money had been stolen. But the robber doesn't see this. He takes the bag of cash, he leaves the bank, and manages to flee and go into the forest before the police show up. And so the police ultimately, they go and search the forest, and they find this campsite deep in the woods. At this campsite, they find the bag that has the money inside of it, and the dye packet has been activated, so clearly the robber had tried to fiddle with it, and then when it detonated, they had taken off and left the money. And then also at this campsite was a screwdriver, a gun, and an audio recorder. Now, at the time, the police that were seeing this, they were part of this huge effort in Gainesville to stop any more attacks on students and catch the killer or killers. That was all they were thinking about. And so when they didn't immediately catch this robber, they kind of said, you know what? This is a lower priority item than what we're dealing with this loose serial killer or killers. And so let's just round up the evidence, put it in storage, and somebody else can deal with this after we handle this killer situation. And so no one listened to the audio recording. They just put it in evidence. And so now this Gainesville police officer that's just remembered this unsolved armed robbery, he says, hey, since Danny has a penchant for armed robbery, maybe he committed this armed robbery. And so we should go look at the evidence and listen to that tape. They hear on this recording a man singing a song. It's clearly a song he wrote, and he's singing about being a, quote, mystery killer. Then, somewhat unbelievably, on this audio recording, the man identifies himself. He says his name is Danny Rawling. And so this audio recording was huge. It meant Danny Rawling, the guy they're looking at as potentially being the serial killer, was definitely in Gainesville in the woods near the University of Florida, the same time frame that all of the victims were killed. They also went into Danny's military records, and it showed he had a blood type of B. So his blood type matched the blood type that had been found in all of the victims' homes. And so just like that, Danny became the #1 suspect, and when they went to figure out where he was, amazingly, they found he was already in custody. He was being held in a jail cell 40 miles south of Gainesville for another armed robbery. And so immediately, Danny was charged in the of the 5 Gainesville students. They couldn't charge him for the 3 Shreveport because they just didn't have enough evidence. And then after that, Danny was transferred to Florida's maximum security prison to await trial. Initially, Danny said he was innocent, he had nothing to do with but then, almost 4 years later, when the first day of his trial, he surprised everyone in the court when he stood up and said, "I'm going to change my plea. I'm guilty on all 5 counts. I did kill all 5 students." 16 years later, at 6 p.m. on October 25th, 2006, Danny Rawling was led into the execution chamber in Florida State Prison. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.